This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Dr. Andrew Kaufman, the American medical doctor, professor of psychiatry, molecular biologist, and expert witness. You studied at Duke, MIT, and the Medical University of South Carolina, where you conducted and published original research and lectured to students, residents, and fellows. Throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, you have contradicted the mainstream media by stating that the coronavirus is not causing a new disease, that there is no evidence of increased mortality, and that modern medicine is the leading cause of death. Today, I'm looking forward to an uncensored conversation about the COVID-19 pandemic, the science behind the virus, and the global erosion of civil liberties. Dr. Kaufman, welcome to London Real.
Thank you so much, Brian. It's really quite a treat to be here.
I'm excited to have you. Before we get started, I just wanted to welcome you to the Digital Freedom Platform, and that's an independent technology solution that is of the people, by the people, for the people. It's available exclusively on our website. I just want to ask everyone watching now to please share this link via the sidebar and let people know what we're doing here. Doctor, I just want to say that I pledge to you that none of this will be edited and that anyone can watch the full version of this episode free without censorship or banning at londonreal.tv/Kaufman. Thanks to the generous donations of tens of thousands of people around the world, also known as the London Real Army. For anyone wanting to become a founding member of the Digital Freedom Platform, they can go to londonreal.tv/freedom to donate. Here at London Real, we've been a platform for free speech since 2011. And Doctor, I'm super excited to have you on today. And I think we maybe just jump right into it. And I wanted to know, what do you mean when you say that there is no evidence of the coronavirus causing disease?
Yeah, well, that's an excellent question. And what I've done is I've gone ahead and looked at all of the papers where there are scientists claiming to find evidence for a new virus, that they claim to isolate the virus. And I've basically scrutinized their procedures, and I've compared that to the history of how viruses and other diseases are proven to cause disease and how they're identified. So I've become familiar with the procedures and how they work. And what I've found is that the scientific procedures that have been utilized in all of these scientific studies are actually, it wouldn't be possible using those techniques to isolate a virus and purify it and prove that it exists. So what they've done really is they've done kind of two things. So one has to do with the genetic material, and one has to do with isolating a viral particle. So I'll talk about those separately. I'll talk first about the genetic material. So the general procedure that they utilize is that they identify someone with an illness that is unexplained. Like this happened with the first group of patients in Wuhan, China, but it's been done in several other places around the world. And they have taken lung fluid from those patients, and they do this through an invasive procedure where they put a fiber optic scope through the mouth or nose down in through the windpipe into the lungs, and they squirt some fluid there and slosh it around, and then they suck it back up. And that would have basically a mixture of different things. It's a very impure sample, so it would contain, secretions from that area, like sputum. And it would also contain a mixture of different cells, such as our own lung cells and our immune cells. It would also contain various microorganisms that are present in our normal tissues, like bacteria and fungi. And then it also, lung fluid has shown to contain free genetic material as well. And then it would also contain what's called exosomes, which have their own genetic material. And I'll elaborate on what they are in just a minute. And so they took this sample of lung fluid, which has genetic material from many sources, and they added an enzyme that would digest any cell membrane. So it basically allows the DNA or RNA to be free in the solution so that they could do further analysis. And then they've identified a sequence of RNA that they allege is from a coronavirus or from the coronavirus family. But the thing is that since this sample is impure and has many sources of RNA, it's impossible to know what the origin of it is. If they wanted to be certain that it came from a virus, what they would do is take that lung fluid and filter it, because you can purify viral particles by filtration because they're much smaller than any other cells, even bacteria cells. And then you typically use a centrifuge with a density gradient that creates a tight band of these particles that's easy to suck up in a pipette. And then you could take those particles and extract the genetic material and say that it came from those particles. But when you have an impure sample with lots of sources of genetic material, you really don't know where it came from. So what their solution to this problem was is to compare the identity of the sequence of this RNA with other known RNA sequences. And they specifically compared it with the SARS-CoV-1 virus, which was the virus allegedly responsible for the SARS outbreak in 2003.
You say
And they
allegedly. We'll get to that, I
allegedly,
guess.
yeah. Well,
Okay.
the thing is that they used the same exact procedures when they did the experiments for that virus. So, in other words, they got the genetic material from an impure sample also, so it's not clear where the origin of that is. So you can follow this back in a chain to some of the original papers, and what I've found pursuing that is essentially the same exact procedures used each time. But how they said that this represented a coronavirus and was related to the SARS-CoV-1 virus, in fact, they call this virus the SARS-CoV-2, is that they looked at the identical nature of the sequences, and they found that it was just under 80% identical. And that's how they said, well, it must be related, and so we'll call it SARS-CoV-2. But the thing is, if you look at the genetic sequence between humans and chimpanzees, you'll find that there's 96% sequence homology or identicality. And so we are clearly not the same as chimpanzees, and no one would say that our genetic material is a part of the chimpanzee family. But yet they're using a sequence identity that has a much lower percentage, under 80% compared to 96, and saying that's a coronavirus because of that. So in my opinion, this is extremely weak science, and without purifying the lung fluid sample, you really can't tell what the origin of the RNA is. So they've used this sequence to develop the main diagnostic test that they're using, which is the PCR test. And aside from any problems using the PCR methodology, we don't know what it's testing for because we don't know the source of that genetic material.
Okay, so they're going around testing people and they're getting back these results, and the results don't necessarily correlate to the person they're testing having anything that might be related to something that might cause a disease. You could get a quote unquote false positive for other things in the past, including maybe flu vaccines or colds or a variety of things that happened to your past, and now they're qualifying you as COVID-19 positive. Is that right?
Yeah, well, it's quite possible that this RNA actually comes from our own cells. So a positive test could just say that we've measured your own RNA. I mean, the thing is, we really don't know what it is, and it doesn't seem to correlate with presenting with actual clinical illness. So lots of people who don't have any symptoms and didn't get ill test positive for this, as well as many people who are ill and have symptoms test negative. So since we don't really know what we're testing, in my opinion, we can't trust the results of this test at all.
And so, but there are people getting sick, dying, and now we're being told that they've been tested positive for COVID-19. You know, when David Icke was here, and by the way, he was here about 3 or 4 weeks ago, mentioned you in your research, which is why how you first got on our radar, and he talked about the exosomes, which we can cover shortly. You know, he was careful to tell me how the language in the media never says someone died of COVID-19. They died after testing positive to COVID-19. And you know, doctor, now it's become a meme where even the public seems to be catching on, where, you know, somebody, some wife shot her husband in her home because they were locked down because of COVID-19, so he died of COVID-19. I mean, it's almost not funny that it's become a joke, because the public seems to know that now everything is being overclassified as COVID-19 related.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, this is a really important thing to look at, because this comes from directives from our public health organizations and agencies. So,
Including
for
the CDC
example,
as well, right?
yeah, the CDC issued a special document that's a guidance on filling out death certificates, and they've essentially gone away from their usual protocols where you want to have some certainty about the cause of death. And they've said that even if there's suspicion that COVID might be the cause of death, that you should just put that as the cause of death on the death certificate without any further scrutiny. In Minnesota, there was a directive that said if someone dies and you suspect it may be COVID-19 related, that not even to bother doing a test post mortem, just label them on the death certificate as COVID-19. And then I also got a document, I think it was from the health commissioner or possibly the governor of New Jersey, a letter to healthcare providers. And it instructed them that in the usual procedure, when there's a health crisis, that they normally would send bodies of people suspected to die related to the crisis for autopsy to the medical examiner. But it said in this case to not send any bodies to the medical examiner, to just essentially label them as COVID-19 deaths. And the only reason I could see that they would institute such a policy is that if they sent them for autopsy, they would probably find that they died of a regular cause. And this would affect the numbers in a bad way in terms of if you're trying to create the appearance that a lot of people are dying from COVID-19. So what I've done in order, since you can't trust this data about the cause of death because of these instructions, what I've
Just
done
by the
is,
way, just want to interrupt really quickly. I've seen interview after interview with these doctors talking about how there's no precedent of any kind of guesswork on an autopsy and on a death certificate. You just say the evidence. And yet this is the first time they're being encouraged to write down the COVID-19. And you hear doctor after doctor talking about how peculiar this is. And I mean, I've gotten emails from people here in the UK telling me of scenarios where they took in their 80-something-year-old, grandfather with kidney failure. He was forced to sign a do not resuscitate order. He was told later he had COVID-19 symptoms. He died. Later, they were told he was never tested positive, but he was being qualified as a death of that type. I mean, we're hearing this over and over again. It's almost flabbergasting to hear. And you
heard one account where someone's child, I think they were a young adult, died in a motor vehicle accident. And on the death certificate, it said they died of COVID-19. And they were really upset because they had no legal recourse related to the traffic accident to, file with the police or get reimbursed by the insurance company because the death was recorded as being from COVID-19.
I mean, that's ludicrous. I mean, somebody told me, I think it was Dr. Buttar told me a couple days ago that someone was driving a car with a face mask on, and he does not believe that those even should be used. Suffered from lack of oxygen, crashed their car, and it was COVID-19. Yeah, it's just hard to believe that's even happening.
It really is, and there's so many accounts that I've heard directly from people speaking with me about this that you combine that with the official documents and you see that this is going on, and so this is why I don't think you can accurately look at any mortality figures attributed to COVID-19 as being accurate whatsoever.
Why is this happening? Why would something like the Center for Disease Control, ask doctors to fudge numbers to inflate the COVID-19 related deaths? I mean, on such a mass scale and at such a high level.
Yeah, well, I'm certainly not advising the CDC how to proceed. So whatever I say would be somewhat speculative on my part. But in looking at what I do know about the CDC, one thing is that it is mostly funded actually by private industry. So there's something called the CDC Foundation, and you see that all of the major companies that represent the healthcare industry, such as pharmaceutical companies, health insurance companies, medical device companies, et cetera, are the financiers of the CDC. And they certainly have a lot of profit to gain based on having a serious pandemic and needing to sell vaccines or testing kits and things like that. I think the hospitals are in a different position financially right now. But it seems that all of the policies that they've initiated would have to be for the immediate purpose of inflating the perception of the health consequences of this COVID-19 situation. But it's definitely not grounded in reality. When I was in my 20s, I had a job for a couple of years. I was working for the New York City Department of Health, and it was in a CDC sponsored position called a public health advisor. And my job was actually to go to hospitals and clinics around New York City and review charts to identify cases of AIDS. And I remember at that time, there were very specific criteria that had to be met in order to qualify a case of AIDS. And I would have to hunt down a lot of information in order to find out if the criteria was met. And if it was not met, I couldn't report it as an AIDS case. So the way that they are instructing people to report COVID-19 cases is a total departure from that approach, and it's very unscientific, and it's fraudulent in my opinion.
And look, I want to go a bit more into the science. If you just had to take a step back right now, what do you think is actually going on? What's your gut feel here as to what is actually happening? You know, what's the most realistic scenario of what's happening?
I would love to answer that, and taking into account all of the evidence I've looked at, which has been almost entirely from peer-reviewed scientific papers and official government websites. My opinion is that this entire pandemic is a completely manufactured crisis. In other words, there's no evidence of anyone dying from any novel illness. And so, what I think is going on, if you look at how the responses and government policies are changing, what we're seeing is essentially that we're having our rights taken away from us. So we don't have the right to leave our homes at our will. We don't have the right to assemble. We don't have the right to travel. We are asked to keep distance from each other. We're asked to cover our face, which is a major barrier to communication. And I see that people are becoming afraid of each other. We have policies in the financial sector where all of these businesses were instructed to close their operations. We have the supply chain for our food distribution systems being shut down, and farmers are asked to destroy meat and crops. We have the Federal Reserve is printing money like it's going out of style. They're buying up corporate debt. They're buying up real estate. All of these things fit to a situation that is in line with a sort of what might be known as a globalist agenda. And I think one document that you can look at that outlines this pretty well is from the United Nations, originally called Agenda 21, but it's been changed to Agenda 2030. And then you have now all of this talk about basically using technology to spy on people. And I'm talking about what they refer to as contact tracing, which sounds somewhat innocuous. The term was originally coined in 1931. And what this is basically trying to coerce us or perhaps even require us to put some kind of tracking app on our cell phones that will contain all kinds of personal data about our health, about where we go and what we do and who we associate with. And all of these things seem to be moving towards control of the people, like government control of the people, that they can track them, they can take away their rights, and they can grant privileges based on the degree that we might cooperate with what they want us to do.
Yeah, and to mention controlling what we can say. So the freedom of speech and freedom of press, they can say on these private platforms, which behave like public utilities. And again, we're working with some lawyers here to prove that a lot of these private social media networks and technology companies are in fact public utilities, especially during this crisis, because they're letting people know what they should and shouldn't do. Now we're seeing the freedom of speech being pulled back, and certain things cannot be talked about, whether it's COVID-19 denial, the 5G relation, all that stuff. I've been a part of it. I've experienced the banning and deplatforming right on the back of that. And this is after 9 years of publishing long-form conversation with nothing happening. So yeah, we've seen that.
Heard about your story and all of you being booted off of all social media and other platforms. And I've actually taken some steps to back up all my material and have contingencies in case I experience the same thing after this interview.
Yeah, I mean, and we just had, Dr. Guitar a couple days ago, and I know someone who was literally watching one of his videos on YouTube while it was pulled, and it just disappeared. And so, yeah, I started saving things as well. And we've got this platform, and we've got another big stream coming up on Sunday with David Icke as well. And I'm asking people to literally screen record it, put it on a thumb drive, and bury it. Now that might be an extreme, but 3 weeks ago when we were live streaming with David Icke, was the second largest YouTube live stream in the world, second only to President Trump. The last thing I would have thought is that would have been deleted, but it was. So yeah, we've got to watch what's going on. Uh, was there ever a pandemic in Wuhan? This is my question, because we were all focused on what happened over there. Then we saw it travel to Italy and travel to Iran and travel to Seattle. Was that happening? Were there things happening on the ground, or do you think that was fabricated?
Well, there were certainly a lot of things happening, but what and I don't know all the details about some of the other places. I've mostly been following things in the United States, but I know that they did actually erect a hospital facility in Wuhan very quickly, and I think it was really not even utilized, and I think it's been taken down since then. But when I heard about the final numbers, once things settled down over there, from a epidemiologist at the University of Manitoba in Canada, and basically he had calculated, based upon the reports of the data over there, what was the death rate, and it was essentially insignificant. So I don't really feel that there's any evidence of increased mortality. And this is the main statistic that I've been looking at, because the way that governments and other organizations identify a possible new health threat is that they look at what they call excess mortality. So in other words, compared to previous years, how many people are dying this year? And if there's a spike in the number of deaths, then that indicates possibly a new health crisis, and then that could be further investigated. So just this morning, I was looking at the CDC website, because they've been reporting weekly mortality statistics since the beginning of the year. And they have this table on their website that's updated on a daily basis, and I've been following it now for about a week. And it reports something very interesting. So it gives of course, the deaths that they attribute to COVID-19, but it also gives the all-cause mortality. So this is, the total number of people that died of any cause. And that is a much more reliable number. It still may have some inaccuracies, but it doesn't have all of the subterfuge associated with the COVID on the death certificate. And what they've done is they've compared this number to the average of the past 3 years, from 2017 through 19, during the same exact weeks. And then they have a running tally for year to date. And so what they are reporting pretty consistently is that the number of deaths this year, year to date, is less than the average of the past 3 years. And currently the number is 94%. So 6% less people have died so far this year in the United States compared to the past 3 years on average. And that amounts to 44,242 people. So those people would have died last year, but they're alive this year. So, if there's no increase in overall mortality, and in fact, there's actually a decrease, then what's the evidence that there's a new disease?
Now, could some of that explained with the lockdown and people aren't driving and having car accidents? That's my first question. The second question is, you bring up a great point, and this is something David Icke mentioned 3 weeks ago, where was the increase in deaths? Since then, I've seen the mainstream media address this. I've seen New York Times show these little spikes in death rates going up in these different cities. So I've seen them show what looked like evidence of increased mortality. Just your thoughts on both of those things.
Yeah, well, the way that you display the information can really affect the perception. There's from day to day and week to week, there's variations in the number of deaths reported. So if you look on a small time scale and you see a spike here or a spike there, it could give the impression that overall there's an increase in mortality. But that's why I look at the year to date numbers, because that includes all of the deaths so far this year, which encompasses the entire period that we've been affected by this pandemic. And when you average those out, it sort of balances out the spikes, because there are also some weeks or days where there actually is a downward trend in the number of deaths. So you have to take all of those little perturbations into account and look at the total data set that's available. And that's where you'll really find the information.
Yeah, and both of us. I'm at MIT in the late 80s, and I think if you, in any statistics class, you can be seen right away that data can be manipulated by how you present it on the graph or how you codify it, everything that can be changed. What about this decreased mortality because of the lockdown? Is that an issue that can skew those results?
Well, it's kind of hard to say, because they're not keeping accurate records on the actual true cause of death. But you could certainly look at some possible areas where the death rate would be reduced. And certainly you mentioned one obvious one, which is decreased traffic accident fatalities. But all in all, being considered, that's actually not a big factor in the total mortality data. It's a relatively small number of deaths compared to the leading causes of death. The other thing that is really important to consider is that people are getting less medical treatment right now. And based on some studies from Johns Hopkins and one published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, medical care could actually be qualified as at least the third leading cause of death in the country. So if people are taking less medications or getting less medical care, then those number of deaths would be reduced. And there have been a couple of studies, one from Israel, and I think one is actually from England, where there was doctors went on strike. And during those strikes, there was actually also a reduced mortality. So one could, look at the numbers from those studies and do a comparative analysis. But it's really, there are some fudge errors to do that kind of analysis, since the current data is so incomplete.
All
But
right, so let me just stop you there really quick. So for people listening, you're saying medical care causes deaths in people. Can you go deeper on that? Because this is counterintuitive to everything we've been taught.
yes, it is. So the study from the Journal of the American Medical Association I'm referring to talks about deaths attributable to prescription drugs, which are not used for an overdose, but taken as directed. So they're not taking extra by mistake or given the wrong dose by mistake. They're taking these medications as directed. And they estimate that annually in the United States, there's approximately 128,000 deaths attributable to prescription drugs. And just to give you one example of how that might be, if you look at Tylenol, a common drug, in Europe, you have paracetamol, which is related to that. Tylenol is acetaminophen. In the United States, pretty much every year, there are about 400 deaths that occur from taking Tylenol as directed. So what the research has done is they've looked at a number of different drugs and made an estimate. And the reason they have to make an estimate, and they were very conservative in their estimation, is because there's no reporting or case capturing of deaths due to healthcare. So the CDC monitors deaths due to all causes except this one. So they really only look at illnesses and disease. They don't look at what's called iatrogenic causes, which is caused by the healthcare itself. The other study that is very prominent is from Johns Hopkins, and where they looked at what they called medical errors. And I won't get into their definition of that, but let's just trust their results. And they once again estimated 250,000 deaths a year from medical errors. Now, there are many other ways that the healthcare can result in fatalities, but these haven't been looked at as carefully, so I'll just not count them in my analysis. But if you combine these two numbers, 250,000 and 128,000, you get 378,000 deaths a year from healthcare. And that puts it above respiratory illnesses as the third leading cause of death, according to the CDC's numbers.
Wow. All right, that's a little grim, but we're going to have to just think about that for a little while. Let me ask you a personal question. What do your colleagues say about you being so outspoken? Because after talking to Dr. Buttar a couple days ago, it seems that this is a case of people keeping their heads down, because if they put their head up and go against the common, consensus of what's going on, whether it's WHO one day or something that the government says the next day, I mean, you can be vilified. Um, yeah, how are you being reacted to by colleagues?
Well, that's a great question, and I've definitely had some negative experiences as a result of this. But I want to say that if you're for healthcare professionals, especially doctors, you've got a lot invested in your career. You've put a lot of time in. You've had a lot of delayed gratification because during all your training, you've lived at very low standard of living, and all this time, most of us have accumulated quite a lot of debt. Sometimes, more than $250,000 of debt. And so when we finish all that training and finally get to practice and start earning a reasonable income, we end up buying a bunch of things and then getting into more debt. And so our whole lives are sort of stuck in this cycle. And if we start to question what we're doing as doctors, and believe me, we all observe that treating patients with the typical, drugs, radiation, and surgery, which were the only things we're really allowed to use, we see many times people are not getting better, and many times they're actually getting worse with this treatment. But if we acknowledge that, then it puts us in a very difficult position that we have to take a risk to actually sacrifice all of that hard work and all of the income that we need to pay back our debts and keep our life going. So for an individual to take this chance, you might end up out of a job. You may end up losing your home. Your car may be repossessed. Your kids won't be able to go to private school. Maybe your spouse will decide to leave you. So there's huge, huge risks. And even myself, like I have been working over several years to try and mitigate this risks and get out of the system overall. And it's been a gradual, stepwise process. And I believe that I'm, going to be very successful in doing that. But but for everyone else, it's much, much more difficult. So many of my former colleagues and friends even who are psychiatrists or other kinds of doctors have not been very happy about what I'm saying at all, and and some of them have completely written me off. But on the other hand, I have had a lot of new people reach out to me, new colleagues, and many doctors actually who really appreciate that I've been speaking, honestly about what I think and taking the risks that I have. And they're very supportive, and they want to learn more and they want to figure things out. And they're going to be facing some very difficult decisions about how they deal with their career moving forward.
I had a flashback to this Hollywood movie where Baldwin's playing some surgeon, some cardiac surgeon, and he has this line where he says, when someone's loved one is in the hospital and they go to the chapel there and they pray that they're going to make it through, he's like, who do you think they're praying to? They're praying to me because I am God, And I think we have this feeling as the public that doctors are somehow these gods, these angelic, without fault people, that everything they say and do must be the right thing, when in fact they're human, they're fallible, and they're wrapped up in an entire establishment and industry that is based on writing papers that are for studies that are funded by pharmaceutical industries. And like there's a lot of vested interests, even if it's not an intentional decision by them, there is a vested interest to kind of go along to get along, and do things they wouldn't normally be the logical things to do. Is that right?
Yeah, you're absolutely correct, and there are so many forces really conspiring against doctors through their training to really be equipped to think for themselves. And this was all established 100 years ago through the efforts of Rockefeller and the Flexner Report. But what happens during your medical education is that they inundate you with so much information, and they really want you to memorize and regurgitate this information. So I remember early on in medical school thinking this is so different from my undergrad because we both went to MIT, and MIT, their goal is to create scientists, so they want you to be able to think. So when I took, biochemistry and cell biology and human physiology there, the exams were open book because you weren't going to find the answers there, right? The answers required you to think and solve problems. But there's no need to memorize reference information because that's going to change over time anyway. So you can use the book as a sort of resource, just like you might use a dictionary if you come across a word that you don't know what it means to refresh your memory. In medical school, by contrast, when I studied molecular biology there, on the exam, questions wanted you to regurgitate the name of an enzyme. And that's just really superfluous to your understanding. It's completely unnecessary to memorize the enzyme name. What's important is to understand the mechanism of the chemical reaction and what are the factors involved so that you know how someone's physiology might change based on changing conditions. And that's not what was emphasized at all. And I think the purpose of flooding you with so much information to memorize is that you don't have time to really think about what you're learning and question it. So, one example that's particularly relevant to this situation has to do with what's known as Koch's postulates. So when I studied molecular microbiology in medical school, they introduced this set of rules called Koch's postulates, named after Robert Koch, a famous microbiologist and physician from a century ago, who they actually have the CDC equivalent in Germany is named after him. It's called the Robert Koch Institute. And he came up with a set of 4 common sense rules of how you prove that a specific microorganism is responsible for causing a disease. And so they emphasized the importance of that, but then they didn't go on to present the experimental evidence for disease X, Y, or Z on how those postulates were demonstrated. They just sort of expected us to assume that they had been, and they went right into learning about the specific organisms and the specific diseases they were alleged to cause. So when you go through this type of an education system where you have to just regurgitate information without really thinking about it, then you continue that pattern. And when you start to practice, they've structured the reimbursement system basically to require you to see as many patients as possible in as short a time as possible, because each patient encounter is reimbursed at a pretty low rate. So since you have all these loans to pay back, and then you have the overhead of having your practice, the building, the x-ray machine, paying nurses and a receptionist, and all of those things, that you basically have to just keep all day long seeing patients. And sometimes they only spend 6 minutes with a patient. So that's really just not enough time to think about things very carefully. You have to just come up with a quick response, usually write a prescription,
Yeah.
and then move on to the next patient.
Yeah, 6 minutes, write a prescription, and move on. And that's kind of what a lot of the medical industry has become. Doctor, let me snap you right back to reality, to New York City, which isn't far from where you are in Syracuse. We're seeing images of these, well, we did a week or so ago, lines around the street. We see these still photos of these ICUs where there's 4 doctors with the whole kit leaning over people. There was all that talk of ventilators. I mean, it looks like a pandemic. People are dying there. Like, what is actually happening there? Because anybody watching us now would say, okay, guys, but there's got to be something happening, or 4 billion people wouldn't be locked down on this planet.
Well, I wish there was evidence of something happening that would justify this lockdown situation. But, you could show photographs of any ICU at any time, and you'd see very sick people, and you'd see doctors and nurses wearing a lot of personal protective equipment, especially if they were doing a procedure. So, it's nothing terribly out of the ordinary. What is out of the ordinary is that hospitals around the world are empty, and they have very strict security to prevent people from going in and seeing what's going on. So there's a relative paucity of images and video from inside these facilities because of that. So, for example, I spoke to someone yesterday in Australia, and he was telling me that his son had like a sports injury, and they were worried about a broken bone. So, and this was, in a major city in Australia. So not out in the country, at a podunk community hospital, but a major hospital in a major city. And he had to basically be really stern to even allow them to come in. Like they just wanted to send them home without any care. But once he was able to get inside, he walked through the hospital and there was not one person there, not one other patient did he see. He went all the way to the radiology department to get an x ray, and there was not one other patient getting any x ray or any other imaging study. They took the picture and then he walked out of the building. And I've never encountered this in my entire professional career. Generally speaking, hospitals are always at or over capacity. And many times when I've tried to admit patients, they've had to wait. Or I'd have to call multiple hospitals and find who had a bed available and do the best I could to secure that bed. I've seen patients waiting in the emergency department for over a week because there are no beds for the hospital. And I've never encountered a situation of an empty hospital, and I've never been to a radiology department that had no studies going on. In fact, it's really important to their business model because the equipment like MRI machines and CT scanners are extremely expensive machines. And so they have to lay out millions of dollars to purchase that equipment. And in order to recoup their cost for doing that, they try to run these machines around the clock, really, because each study that they do for a patient generates reimbursement. So it's just extremely counterintuitive and impossible to explain how all of these hospitals would be empty and not using all of their equipment when there is the largest health disaster that we've seen in at least 100 years. And then compound that with all of the layoffs of healthcare personnel. So in the United States, they're laying off nurses, pharmacists, lab techs, and other healthcare practitioners. And I've known people in my personal life who are experiencing this. So why wouldn't they need every single qualified healthcare professional to be on the ground treating people if there were so many people who were sick and dying?
Yeah, and the same thing's happening in London. I mean, for the last 4 or 5 weeks, I would walk by the Royal Free Hospital here in London near Belsize Park, and there is nothing going on but the rent there. I mean, there's just nothing. It's just a dead zone. And I thought maybe I just couldn't see or I wasn't looking right, but there's just nothing happening there. And they built this whole 4,000 person Nightingale Hospital at the Excel Center, which is normally a convention center here, to be prepared for all the coronavirus patients. And now I don't even think it's been used. So I think the public is starting to see a lot of that evidence. And it's strange and it's concerning. You mentioned technology about how we're rolling back our civil rights. They're starting to track us. It's mind-boggling to me that my mobile phone company is already giving out my location information. It's mind-boggling to me that Google and Apple will consider doing it. Maybe they already are. Whereas a few months ago, they wouldn't unlock a phone for the police if there was a serial killer. Now they seem willing to give everybody else's information up. So that's kind of boggling. But what about 5G? I'm curious what your stance is on that. And just for the record, I couldn't even say this word in the same sentence or paragraph as coronavirus, or literally we would have been pulled right now off of a YouTube stream. The video would have been deleted and I would have been systematically banned on platforms. And I've done that. Facebook 2 days ago stopped me from advertising on that platform. So I was spending £50,000 a month with them on advertising. Now I can't spend a dime. They won't tell me why. They said it's not due to my content, which was false and misleading, and that it has nothing to do with my ad account. But I know it is, because if I put the most innocuous ad up for a puppy dog or a unicorn, it gets denied. So it's not the ad content. It's obviously us being, censored. But just back to the topic, what does 5G play in this? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, Brian, I want to say that I have had some videos being taken down also, and they didn't mention anything about 5G because I haven't said much about it. And the reason for that is, as I've said, I don't see any evidence of any novel disease. So I don't see any evidence that any 5G technology is resulting in any disease at present. But there are some really concerning things about 5G that I would like to mention. So one of them is that about a year ago, the chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, which is the agency that regulates the telecommunications industry in the United States, made a big announcement about that they're going to be starting to roll out the 5G technology. And he said specifically that they were not planning to conduct any studies to look at any health effects from it. And I thought this is quite odd because there are lots of studies with our existing telecommunications technologies like 4G and 3G that have shown some significant health effects, including brain tumors called acoustic neuromas associated with cell phone use. There have also been lots of reports of people having symptoms from smart meters, which use a very powerful Wi-Fi signal, and it causes things like headaches, nosebleeds, and ringing in the ears. So it's very curious that they would not want to study the health effects because that would protect the population. The other strange thing is that right now, as a result of the lockdown situation, they've suspended all business activities except those deemed to be essential. Now, certainly repair of our current telecommunications infrastructure would be essential because obviously during a pandemic situation, we would need to have adequate communication capabilities. But what is puzzling is that there is a feverish effort by companies like Verizon and others to install 5G infrastructure right now during this situation at a lightning pace. I've heard, accounts from several people in that industry who talk about, working around the clock, having shifts of backup workers ready to come in if someone gets injured or sick. And it just doesn't make sense why they would be trying so hard to install this, given what they have restricted all of the other businesses from conducting. So I wanted to, do some more research on this to see, what I could find. And there's very little in the way of studies that look at the direct health effects. But I did find a very interesting study that was from 1977. So in other words, they were looking at this technology a long time ago, even though they may have not been able to put it out in terms of a wireless network. And this was actually a CIA document that was declassified. And what it did is it studied mice who were exposed to frequency bands around 60 gigahertz, which is part of the stated range of 5G. So these are millimeter waves. They're much shorter wavelength than the current telecommunications technology, and they have different properties. And in these experimental mice, they demonstrated two findings that I think are very significant. One finding is that it caused suppression of the bone marrow. And the bone marrow is the part of our body where all our blood cells are made. So this caused low blood counts, white cells, red cells, which is known as anemia, and also platelets, which, if they're low enough, can cause bleeding problems. The other main finding from this study in the experimental mice was that the radiation disrupted the mitochondria's ability to take up oxygen. So mitochondria are a special organelle inside of our cells. They're actually thought to have been an independent microorganism originally that somehow became a parasite and then became integral to our function. And they're present in all mammal cells. And they're the energy factory of the cell. So they're the only part of the cell that can use oxygen to undergo a process called oxidative phosphorylation, which yields a lot of energy, way more than our other system, which is glycolysis, which is similar to fermentation. And so in this study, it's found that the ability of the mitochondria to take up and utilize the oxygen was seriously impaired, up to, I believe, 64% in the kidney. So this could have devastating health effects and could cause organ failure chronically, or even acutely could result in death potentially by disrupting the organ's ability to create energy. They can't carry out their normal processes without that energy. It would be like if I tried to unplug my computer right now, in a short amount of time, we would lose our connection. And so these potential effects are quite troubling to me. I don't know exactly how the 5G infrastructure is going to be utilized and what frequency is going to be used for what part of it. But it certainly is quite concerning that they're not going to study it, that they are installing it now when all other similar activities are stopped. And there are at least some pretty scary health consequences that are potentially going to be realized.
So there's a regulator here in England called Ofcom, and they regulate all broadcasts by public media companies, and usually mainstream because they haven't got into regulate the internet yet. But we give our shows to a television company here called London Live, and they went out and streamed. Funny enough, actually, the first Ike episode we did in 2020, that actually wasn't the one that was banned, and they got censored by Ofcom because, you know, again, mentioning 5G with coronavirus. That was the one directive they said was not allowed. And they censored other radio stations, and they had to put apologies back up, and so did this television company that I'm not really associated with. I just give them our content. But that was the one thing, doctor, that wasn't allowed. You could say that chewing on aluminum foil would cure coronavirus. That's fine. You could say, but it was those two links. And the peculiar thing is that this same regulatory agency is responsible for the 5G licenses. So I've just never seen more of a conflict of interest or a peculiar way of censoring people to not talk about this one specific thing. And then, of course, now that's carried over into the YouTube and the other social media platforms where the combination of those two is a surefire way of getting deplatformed.
Well, I think I kind of realized early on that this was something that was risky to talk about. And, that's why I've generally not really brought it up or stayed away from it. However, if I thought that it was causing anyone to be ill at present, I would definitely not be afraid to talk about it. But it is very concerning that why would they censor this particular topic if there's really nothing for us to be concerned about? I mean, I think it's really important to realize that if people like me were just talking nonsense and we had no credibility, then why would we be censored? They could just point out that we're talking nonsense and no one would really listen, because I think, your viewers and other viewers out there of alternative media and citizen journalism, they're not naive and gullible people. A lot of them actually do their own research. And so they're going to use discrimination and discernment when they hear people talk. And so I think it's quite telling what gets censored. And I think things are much more likely to get censored if they threaten the strategy or the hidden agenda of the elite system.
Yeah, most definitely. And, just recently, again, we had Dr. Buttar on, and was basically saying plainly that, if there is a link, it's that the 5G might compromise the immune system. And he kind of went into depth on that. And that's something interesting to look into more. I had a question. Go ahead.
That's consistent with the study I mentioned about bone marrow suppression, because the white blood cells are the main cells that are in the immune system. So if they are suppressed and their numbers are low, then that would have a direct effect on the immune system.
Yeah, and then we're seeing that a lot of people are saying with population density becomes 5G tower density. And then there's been other people that have come back and say, look, there's no 5G presence in Iran, but now I'm being told that there is, and there has been one that's been developed. So, to be continued on this, but there definitely seems to be a link between, lower immune systems and 5G. As far as the link between coronavirus and 5G, well, that's a whole nother story. Again, from what you're stated, that we're actually looking at the wrong thing, which is a powerful point of view to listen to Dr. Kaufman here, because, that in itself is a sleight of hand to most of the world right now, isn't it? Because everyone's like, oh, the COVID-19, oh, the coronavirus, this, and you're like, wait a second, it's the lens and the language that's wrong here, folks. If you take yourself one step above that, then you're kind of looking at things, I think, the way you are now. Is that maybe a way of me quantifying that by saying a different lens, where now you're not looking? It's like that old saying, if all you have is a hammer, then everything's a nail. If all you have is a COVID-19 test, then everyone's positive. Whereas if you say, wait a second, we're not even looking for the right thing, or what we're looking for is giving us false positives, it does change the whole conversation, doesn't it?
Well, all of this research and all of our common understandings about things like viruses and contagion is all built on the foundation that germs cause disease, and specifically viruses. But the thing is, when you look at logic and reasoning, you'll understand that whoever proposes a theory, they are the ones with the burden of proof to show that that theory is correct and accurate. And if they are unable to show that, then any other science that's built on that foundation is erroneous and has to be discounted and reanalyzed in order to interpret correctly. So all of this is built on the premise that there is a virus that's been identified that causes a disease. And the burden of proof has not even been close to have been met on showing that that is actually true through experimental evidence. So any of these higher level things like what the test means, it really can't be interpreted because the fundamental underlying premise has not been demonstrated.
Yeah, and that's an excellent point. And now, if we could just move into some of the players here and then some of the proposed solutions. And, someone mentioned, Dr. Anthony Fauci, who's been at the Trump briefings pretty much every night. Some nights it seems like he's on the way out, and some nights it seems like he's on the way in. And he's got a very doctor presence to him, kind of like your childhood doctor, that always make everything feel good. He's got that doctor sensibility, very kind of trustworthy and calm. And so, in a media presence, he's very good. But then when I start learning more, people are saying, a lot of these people in the establishment are of this type, whereas let's find a germ and let's try to kill it with something. Let's find a germ and let's try to kill it with something. I think that's kind of what you were just alluding to previously, as in kind of the whole process of this is potentially flawed. And then when you start looking into Fauci, you start looking into vaccines, and then of course, lately there's a lot of talk about Bill Gates and then the Event 201. So I don't know where we begin because there's quite a few things there. Maybe we start with some of this concept of, guys looking for germs in the establishments and looking for fixes. Am I describing that correctly?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you, let's say that you're, a young person and you want to be a scientist and you want to study viruses, right? So you do your undergraduate work, you try to get good grades, you try to get your name on a research paper, and then you apply to graduate school. And when you start in graduate school, how you perform there is going to determine if you get a job afterwards or not. And it's going to determine if you're able to defend your thesis accurately and earn that PhD. And but the orientation of all the academic departments who award this PhD and who train these future virologists, they all adopt the dogma of germ theory. So it's presupposed before you even start to do any studies. And so when you start to learn the protocols, they basically teach you the same protocols that I described earlier that are done for all the studies where they allege that they're isolating and identifying a new virus. And you never question that underlying premise that viruses cause disease. You just, of course, it's true. They told me it was true. I've known it since I was a young lad. I've seen people get sick and pass colds to each other, and that was by a virus. And so you never question that. And then that's the underlying, it's like your identity. It's like it's like your underwear that you put on every day, that it's always there and it always underlies everything. And so then you learn the techniques and you want to get a good job, maybe with a university, maybe in the pharmaceutical industry, or even with the government. And of course, they want to see that you also adopt the same kind of methods and ideas that they have. And then you look at how the research is funded, and most of the funding comes from government grants. And all the government grants with respect to viruses are all based on the germ theory model. So there's really no room to come up in that system and have different ideas. And this is one of the advantages that I've had, not being a formally trained virologist, but being someone who has experience and knowledge about reading scientific papers and statistics, that I don't have to accept any premise because I'm not beholden to that. I have nothing invested in it in terms of my career or finances. So I can look at this thing as an outsider and say, well, what do these studies really show? because I definitely do have spent a lot of time learning how to design experiments and the various principles of how you use a scientific experiment to draw a certain conclusion. And I'm able to see that they're actually not following those basic rules. I mean, like, for example, one rule is to separate variables, what's called dependent variables, in order to measure the effect of each individual variable on the outcome. And when you combine a bunch of them together, then you don't know which one is influencing the outcome. And they have not followed that basic tenet because they've not purified the different chemicals or cells, which would be the way to separate the variables. But interestingly, when you look at the virology science outside of disease causing viruses, but look at viruses that have been identified in lower organisms like bacteria or amoebas or algae, they do actually follow those principles in those studies. So it's quite interesting because they've developed the standard methods of how do you purify and isolate a virus in its pure form and then observe it so that you can characterize it. But when it comes to human viruses, they have just put this aside. And so there is one example of that I know of a mainstream virologist whose name is Dr. Stefan Lanka, and he's a German virologist. And he actually, earlier in his career, discovered one of these viruses that is present in sea algae. Now, he also uncovered some evidence that the virus in algae is actually not destructive, but actually helps the algae survive in difficult times or difficult environmental conditions. So once he made this discovery and was thinking about where he would like to go next with his research, he started looking at viruses alleged to cause human disease because he thought he could do some good learning about these, maybe help people's health. But when he started looking at it, he uncovered the same flaws in the scientific method that I uncovered, and where their virus was never purified. And so it was unable to prove that it existed. So after he started talking about this in public and received a lot of scrutiny, as you might imagine, he decided to issue a challenge. And he put out a challenge for the measles virus. And he said, if anyone can provide the scientific papers that prove the measles virus exists, that he would pay them $100,000. And so some people did submit papers, but they were not sufficient to prove this because the research hasn't done that. But there was one person that was very certain that he actually had the proof. And so he took Dr. Lanka to court. And this court case went all the way up to the German Supreme Court. And the German Supreme Court had to have expert witnesses in order to weigh in on this because the judge was unable to, instruct the jury properly or make a determination on their own. And I think that was very wise. And I think it was very embarrassing for the scientists that had to do this because they had to concede that actually there's no proof that measles exist. And so Stefan Lanka was vindicated by the Supreme Court. So what I'm saying is that the Supreme Court of Germany actually ruled that there is no measles virus that's been proven to exist.
And what does that mean then? Ultimately, to the layman, like, what does that mean?
Well, what it means is that the illness that they call measles is not caused by a virus, or at least there's no proof that it's caused by a virus because the virus they say caused it actually has not been shown to exist.
Okay. All right. Well, the next word that's on everyone's mind is vaccine. We're hearing this over and over again. And as people are looking deeper into vaccines and who's funding, from what I've heard, even a majority of the vaccines for the coronavirus, then it's a lot of times leading back to Bill Gates. And, it's fascinating to watch the narration of a man change almost 180 degrees in the last 2 years. What is going on with vaccines and what's going on with Bill Gates?
Well, the thing that keeps coming back to my mind about Bill Gates in this arena is from a TED talk that he gave, where he made a statement to the effect of, through vaccines and family planning, we could reduce the world's population by 15%. And 15% of the world's population is somewhere around 1 billion people, billion with a B. And, certainly he comes from a family of eugenicists, and that's well established in the historical record. So one could speculate that this is some kind of eugenics agenda that he has in mind. But he certainly made other statements recently that basically we will not be able to get back to any kind of normalcy in our day to day lives. And he specifically mentioned things like concerts or sporting events at arenas where you have large gatherings of people until, every single person is vaccinated. So there's clearly he has a very strong motivation and incentive to roll out vaccinations. And I think through the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, that has been their principal aim in terms of their, so-called charitable endeavors, is to, vaccinate everyone in the world for all of the so-called communicable diseases. So when I first, through medical school, they don't
And he's
really.
also talking about having like this vaccination passport or this tattoo or this ink that kind of shows you've had the vaccination. And then that allows you, like you said, to congregate, to travel on airplanes, almost puts you in this high social score, which seems to almost be mirroring some of the oppressive, regimes in China, as far as you kind of have to earn the ability to have certain freedoms.
Absolutely. And that fits right in with the contact tracing technology I was talking about earlier. And yes, there is this invisible ink tattoo, which I believe was attempted to be implemented on some children in Southern Africa, but was rejected by the local people there, rightfully so. But they're already using vaccines as a way to grant or deny certain privileges in our society. But so far, they've only done this with children. So in New York State, where I am, your child can not attend any school, either public or private. So even if you pay completely for the schooling, if your child is not vaccinated, they're not allowed to attend that school. So that's a privilege that is denied based on not complying with vaccines.
And
So I think.
the funny thing is, Buttar said to me, he said, if you choose not to vaccinate your child, he said, they're the ones that are technically going to get sick. It's not the other kids that are vaccinated. So he finds it almost ludicrous that parents are worried about unvaccinated children. If you believe in that whole theory and the vaccines, then your children should be fine. And yet there still is this uproar and this need for everyone to get these chemicals injected in their children's bodies.
Yeah, so I mean, I see that as basically a public relations campaign to try and convince people that, the kids who are not vaccinated are a danger to their vaccinated kids. And you're right, it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. But there's not very much about vaccines that makes a lot of sense, because if you actually go back and look for the evidence that vaccines have prevented disease, you're not going to find any.
What about smallpox?
Well, smallpox is an interesting example because it actually was devised based on a different principle than our modern vaccines. So, modern vaccines say that you induce immunity to an illness by giving an antigen, which is something that would stimulate our immune system, but not giving the actual infectious agent. The smallpox vaccine was a different theory. There, what they did was that they had cows that had cowpox, and that's why the name vaccine, it comes from the Latin root for cow, and that disease is called vaccinia. And so that's where the word vaccine comes from. And so what they did is they had this theory that if you get a milder form of a disease, it prevents you from getting a more severe form of it. They had no concept about immunity at that time, so it was based on a different theory. And what they did is they took pus out of cowpox lesions on a cow and then made a small incision in the skin of a human and put the pus basically right in the cut. So exactly what we're always told not to do if we get a cut is don't put dirty things in it, like the pus from an animal. But this is what Edward Jenner did for this, so-called smallpox vaccine. And interestingly, when he was developing that, he actually tested this on his son, and his son ended up crippled as a result of that. And so, in the history books, the mainstream history books, the smallpox vaccine has been touted as a major success. But that's not really accurate. If you go back and look at data from the Royal Academy of Sciences, what you'll see is that the mortality increased substantially from smallpox while these vaccines were widely used. And then when they stopped being used, the numbers went back down again. So it's really difficult to trust what is in like a general textbook or a mainstream history book without going and looking at the actual data yourself. Because all of the textbooks that were in medical school say that vaccines are responsible for preventing many of these major illnesses that were, people considerably suffered from and worried about in the first part of the 20th century. But if you look at some of the same diseases that did not have a vaccine, like scarlet fever, for example, you'll find that scarlet fever also went away with all the other diseases, even though there was no vaccine for it. And when you look at the number of cases of various illnesses like polio or measles or diphtheria, you'll see that the prevalence or incidence of those diseases and mortality from those diseases, which in some was substantial, went down almost to the current levels before a vaccine was even available for use. So you couldn't possibly attribute a vaccine for causing that reduction in the illness if it wasn't even around at the time that the illness was reduced.
Okay. Well, now the race for the vaccine is on. And there's groups all around the world with various levels of funding coming from various organizations trying to be the first. And there's some people in Oxford here that I think are actually starting their clinical trial with 1,000 people. And apparently they put their vaccine in some rhesus monkeys and had some success already. And they are racing forward, right? Because everyone's kind of being told lately, the latest one I've heard is, until there's a vaccine, nothing will go back to normal. And there will be some state of lockdown or semi-lockdown until then. Is this all hocus pocus? Are these people chasing the wrong thing? Are these stupid scientists? And will this ever become a reality? What do you see?
Well, Brian, if you create a vaccine for an illness that has not been proven to even exist, then the vaccine couldn't possibly work. But if you do a clinical study and have an imaginary disease and give the vaccine to people and then they never get the imaginary disease, it would give the appearance that it's very successful. So this is a real win-win strategy for anyone making these vaccines, and which is why there have been companies all over the world racing to be the first one to have a vaccine that's been proven to be safe or effective in the limited criteria that they require. And because whoever gets there first, according to the plans or proposed policies, they're going to be selling billions of vaccines, billions. So they're going to make billions of dollars as a result of this. So there's such a strong financial incentive. Some of the technological strategies that they're using to create these vaccines are quite scary and unprecedented. So there is a company, I believe, in California that has a vaccine technology that I believe is currently in early clinical trials. And this vaccine doesn't work in the way that normally we're told vaccines do, where you have like a piece of a virus that's inactivated in some way and inject that in that causes an immune response and we make antibodies to it. What this is it's actually a circular piece of DNA that has one or more genes that creates a gene product from the so-called virus. And what they want to do is actually get this DNA to be taken up by our own cells and made into proteins. And then those proteins would actually cause an immune response to what I'm not sure, but it could be to our own cells. And in order to do this, they have to use a special technology. So it's not like a regular vaccine where there's just a syringe with one needle and a liquid containing whatever's in the vaccine, and they just put it in. This has three needles. So the needle in the middle is the typical type that the material would flow through. But the other two needles on either side are actually electrodes. And what they do is they generate an electric current inside of our cells. And this creates what's called electroporation. So this is a well-established technology used in the laboratory where they're trying to get genetic material into a cell to see what it expresses and study it. And what happens is that the electricity causes the cell membranes to create little holes called pores. And then the genetic material can enter the cell through those pores, whereas normally the cell membrane would be a barrier and keep the genetic material outside the cells. And so they're using this technique, and they're basically, this is a form of gene therapy. So they would actually be changing the genetic makeup of our own cells in the local area where they're injecting this. And I think this is something that could be used for all sorts of purposes that we may not know about because we don't really know what these genes represent. Remember, I was talking about the source of this genetic material is undetermined. So it's really scary, but obviously it couldn't prevent a disease that doesn't exist. So there must be some other purpose for it.
It does sound pretty sinister when you start thinking about those scenarios. How does this play out, doctor? I mean, 6 months from now, when they're telling everybody you have to get this vaccine and these things have been successful, and I mean, how does that end up? It doesn't seem like there's any way around the public getting there unless we start kind of raising these questions now.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I've really been trying to do is just raise awareness and try to encourage people to just ask some questions about things that don't add up. Why are nurses being laid off if we're in a medical crisis? And if you just think, well, on the surface, obviously that doesn't make any sense. So what other contradictions might there be? What else doesn't add up? And if you want to investigate that, you can't look at the regular media outlets because they all say the same thing. And they basically say whatever the government officials want them to say. So you need to look independently, and you can go on even government websites. You can find the real information. I mean, they're not advertising this, but they are saying it on their websites. Even Dr. Fauci, he wrote an editorial in the New England Journal of Medicine, one of the most prominent medical journals in the world, on February 28th. And in that article, he said that the COVID illness is akin to a seasonal flu pandemic with a mortality rate of 0.1%. But then a couple of days later, he turned around and made an announcement from the White House that we need to, continue the lockdown measures for another period of time. So why would he be saying to the medical community not to worry, that this is just like the flu? And we certainly never have ever had any lockdown procedures or stripping away of rights or financial shutdown from any influenza. So if you simply look at some contradictory statements and actions like that, it's a place to start questioning things. And then you can figure out what's going on. What I think is really important to delay or overcome these tyrannical methods that are already present and are expected to intensify in the future is simply to decide not to follow them. So, in my personal life, I'm not following these directives. Now I don't like run up to people and get close to them because I don't want to make them uncomfortable and I want to respect people's own decisions. But I don't stay far away from people. I don't stand on the little red tape or the dot at the store, and I certainly am not going to wear any masks. And I even refuse to wear a mask at my remaining doctor job that I had part time. And the consequence was that is that I was terminated from that job. And but the thing is that it's much more important to make a decision to preserve our rights than it is to risk money. or prestige or anything else. Because if we live in a future where we don't have any freedom and any rights, it's not going to be any life worth living. And especially for my children, I mean, I don't want them to be subjected to that at all. And I don't want them to, 10, 20 years down the road say to me, Dad, back when they were locking us all up in our house and making us take all these vaccines, did you do anything to try and stop it? I want to be able to, say to them proudly that I did everything in my power possible to try and stop it. And what people need to realize is that we outnumber the people calling the shots by orders of magnitude. And if just a small percentage of us decide to just not put up with these measures and dictates, then there's really nothing that they're going to be able to do to stop us. But I want to also say that I am very hopeful and optimistic about our future, because I see people on a daily basis. More people are becoming open and aware to what's going on. They're looking at things much more critically. And I think there's a really strong chance that we can all come together and perhaps even recreate a new normal that is not based on spying on us, on controlling our movements and privileges, and on tyranny, but one that is based on real freedom, where we don't have to rely on central authority figures to tell us what to do and dictate our pursuits and freedoms, where we have full property rights and the freedom to uh, interact with our neighbors, to earn wealth and prosperity, to feed ourselves and families, and live the kind of life that we all deserve to live as human beings.
Yeah, I'm hoping everyone can get just a lot of gratitude out of this experience. I think about what I'm going to tell my kids every single day, if not multiple times a day, when they grow up. What did I do in this period? What is the science behind masks and social distancing? I mean, besides the fact that you don't believe that this coronavirus is causing disease, what is there or not there in your opinion?
Yeah, well, there's not a lot of studies on it. With social distancing, this is a pretty new idea. There is one review article that's in the BMC Public Health Journal. And essentially, the main conclusion of that review article is that there are no actual real world studies that are not biased. And they say that there's a couple of real world studies, but they're so biased in how they were designed, you can't really look or trust the outcomes. Then they have other studies that are just done on computer models. And I have, direct experience working with computer models at a biotechnology company. And I've read a lot about computer models applied to other scientific areas. And computer models are something that is good for generating hypotheses, but they can essentially be tweaked in any way that you want to give any outcome that you want. And the reason for this is simple, that there are just a lot of unknown variables, and depending on how you select the values for those variables, you influence the outcome of whatever you're looking at. So just like when they had used computer models to tell us how many people were going to die of this disease, they were off by, major amounts. I mean, not even close to the reality. And that's typically what you find. And so they say that based on the computer models, it shows social distancing might be correct, but I don't think that has any credibility whatsoever. With respect to the masks, they first of all, let me tell you about masks restrict your breathing. And this can be very problematic, even for a healthy person with no breathing or respiratory illness. But for someone who has asthma or COPD or other forms of lung or airway disease, I mean, it could be devastating trying to walk around and do your activities with a mask. On top of that, the materials that the mask is made from have potential toxicity in and of themselves. So if you have a fiberglass mask, every time you breathe in, little particles of fiberglass are going into your lungs, and that's known to cause disease. Plus, there are various other solvents and chemicals that may be in there that you're breathing the vapors of that with every breath, and we don't know what the outcome of those things are. There is one study I came across that actually looks at how well masks work for preventing spread of the flu. And they looked at no masks, they looked at medical masks like the N95, and they looked at makeshift cloth masks, which is what a lot of people are using right now. And in that study, and it wasn't very conclusive because the confidence intervals overlapped one on the relative risk. So that means that it wasn't very strongly powered statistically. So you should take the results with a grain of salt, because the result might be actually that there's no difference between any of the masks or no mask. But what the main conclusions of the study were is that the group that wore the cloth masks actually had a higher rate of getting the flu than wearing no mask or wearing the medically produced mask. So if you take that seriously, then what you would say is that people wearing cloth masks now actually are increasing their risk of getting sick. So it definitely goes against the common wisdom. My main criticism prima facie of the masks, aside from the psychological and social consequences, is that the pore size of the mask is 1 to 2 orders of magnitude larger than the size of a viral particle. So a virus particle is about 100 nanometers, according to what they say about this alleged COVID virus. And the pore size of the mask, an N95 mask, is on the order of microns or micrometers. So it'd be 1 to 2 orders of magnitude difference. So it would be like if you were trying to walk through a door and that door was 100 feet high and 100 feet wide. It wouldn't really stop you. Someone else made an analogy that if you put a chain link fence around your garden to keep out mosquitoes, right? There's no chance that it would work. So I think these masks are for another purpose. And I think it's to separate people from each other, alienate people from each other. I mean, if we look in our society, who would wear a mask like this, aside from a surgeon, it would actually be someone who is a criminal who is trying to hide their identity.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about how it just completely distances you from someone socially because there's no facial expressions. So, well, first of all, when you see someone with a mask, you're reminded of the fear that's happening. You're reminded of the situation. You're reminded of your danger. You're reminded of the mistrust that's happening between them and you, or you and them. It's hard to know which one. Then you're not assured by a facial expression. You can't see a smile. You can't see anything reflecting. So it just divides us further and separates us as if we're not already separated on lockdown. And the more divided we are, the more we're in fear we are, the more we're suspicious of each other, then we can be controlled. Everybody knows that goes back thousands of years. And yet it's playing out right in front of our eyes, and we're being scared into doing things that are inconceivable. And like you said, the only people that would normally wear masks are bank robbers and outlaws. And now I see them. I see them in my Uber drivers. I see them with people in the streets. But I mean, just for the record, I don't wear a mask. I'm not going to wear a mask. I hug people. I shake their hands if they want to shake my hand. And I'm not doing any of this. And when I see people queuing outside of stores with 2 meters, 3 meters, 4 meters sometimes between them, it just all seems like madness. I just want to scream at the top of my lungs, doctor, and say, is anybody seeing that this is all crazy? And yet I don't think it would resonate right now.
Well, Brian, I wish I was there at the studio with you so we could demonstrate this for the audience.
Well, I mean, and look, I'll be honest, but Ike and I have made we've made an effort to show us shaking hands, and I will shake hands with him when I see him on Sunday when we do our massive broadcast, which will be the largest broadcast of a conversation in human history. We're expecting 1 million plus people live streamed on our independent platform because we can't do it anywhere else because our human rights have been taken away. And yeah, we're going to shake hands. Like, that's what we've been doing. And, he's turned 68 yesterday. So he's the target market for this, as you say, alleged COVID-19. And yet he's not concerned because he doesn't buy into it, much like you. A couple closing things. Dr. Fauci, what do you see there? Do you see a man who is complicit? Do you see a man that is built by the system and is just following what he thinks is right? What do you see?
Well, no, I think he's part of the system, and I think he's probably being directed on what to say in terms of his policy recommendations and his public statements. And, since there's such a big contradiction between what he says to the general audience versus what he writes in a medical journal. And you can also, look back at his role in government science in the past, like in the war on cancer, which was largely about trying to find viruses that cause cancer, and it was a major failure. And he was involved in trying to resurrect that community, and there was some very questionable things that he did in terms of publication and sharing data and things like that. So I think he has a clear track record of doing what's in his best interest or what is in his benefactors' best interest, and I think he's just kind of following along with the program.
Yeah, it's been interesting to watch. It's also been interesting to watch Trump at these conferences where his gut reaction telling him not to do this stuff. His gut reaction is saying something's not right, and I know the economic damage being done is so severe, and yet you're not allowed to talk about that because you're seen as insensitive and inhumane, when in fact, talking about it would probably be one of the more humane things to discuss. I could just, yeah, everyone can see his unease, and people chart it off with, oh, he's just an egomaniac that's worried about his reelection, and maybe he is, but I think he's grappling with something that just doesn't sit right in his gut. He's been around, he's built companies, he's built empires. I think his sixth sense is telling him something's not right here, is kind of what I see. Talk to me about the economic issues here, even from a health perspective, that's going on with this lockdown happening. They're talking about, the economy shrinking as much as 20%, employment going through the ceiling. What do you see happening there?
Well, I think it's really interesting and telling what's going on in the healthcare sector, because since all of these hospitals are empty and they've canceled all their scheduled and elective surgical procedures and other types of evaluations, and those things are where they make a lot of their revenue. So they're hurting big time. That's why they're laying off healthcare workers, because they have no money coming in and no ability to pay the salaries. They just need to cut costs. And I don't know what is going to be the ultimate outcome, but if this continues much longer, many of the hospitals are going to be forced to close. And then many of the healthcare workers are going to be unemployed and unable to find work until something changes and a new system reestablishes, or however things are going to go in the future. Some of the other things are quite telling, which is how the hospitals are getting reimbursed presently. So they're getting reimbursed substantially higher to put people on ventilators, for example. They're getting reimbursed higher for COVID-19 diagnoses versus other diagnoses. So if you put a hospital system into a very economically depressed situation on where they have to lay off people and then offer financial incentives, they're going to jump on those because they're just trying to stay in business. So it's really fascinating. And then looking in other sectors where you had this major resignations of CEOs from companies like in various industries, and seemingly to voluntarily just shut down their operations and lose revenue. I mean, what about the professional sports organizations? The NBA and Major League Baseball, and I mean, how could they just shut everything down and lose all that revenue? It's totally insane. What's going on there, and it's having devastating effects. One thing that I think is really important, looking at just real people in the communities who have their own business. So if you have any form of retail business now that is not a liquor store or a pharmacy, you're out of business, because small business owners they don't have huge cash reserves like big corporations do. They often are going month to month with their finances, and if they don't have anyone buying their products, they're not going to be able to stay in business. So it seems that there's this big shift in the retail market from any small businesses to only big box stores or online operations, because they haven't forced Walmart or Costco or any of these big box stores to close. And it would seem actually that it would be more risk of disease transmission in a big store where you have bigger crowds of people than in a smaller store where it's much easier to control the flow of people. So once again, it doesn't make sense in terms of what they're telling us about this, fake illness, but it does seem to shift the economy that, as individuals now, we're no longer permitted to run small businesses to feed our family. Instead, we're going to have to become employees for large corporations if we have any chance of making ends meet. And this is true for the restaurant and bar industry above all else, because they really rely almost exclusively on people being coming to their establishment and spending time there, and that is the thing that is completely prohibited now. And there's clearly not enough ability to maintain a takeout business because so many of the restaurants in my areas that were extremely popular and had a thriving takeout business, they're closed for business now. And I'm not sure exactly why that is, but I know as a consequence of shutting down all the restaurants that there's been a lot of food that has had to be destroyed. And because this doesn't quite make sense to me, and maybe you have some further thoughts, but so people are still eating, there's still the same number of people, so the demand for food should be relatively consistent. Now I know that there's a people are eating in a different place now. They're not eating at restaurants. They're much more eating at home and preparing their own foods, which actually could be much healthier for them if they choose the right foods. But it would seem that the total amount of food manufactured or produced should be roughly the same. But yet, what we've seen is that supply chain distribution networks have been shut down. And there's lots of farmers that were basically just burying their harvests in the dirt. And I heard a rancher talking about this just yesterday, that he's been ordered to basically euthanize his harvest of beef. And he was really upset about this because there's demand for the meat. And I really am concerned about how this is going to affect our food supply going forward. We've already seen that various items in the supermarkets are not available anymore. And we've also seen people being prohibited from buying seeds in various retail establishments. So, where is this going in terms of our food supply? Are we going to be facing famines in the near future?
Yeah, these are really important questions. And I mean, the devastation for small businesses, it's hard to overstate that, because that's really the bulk of the economy. People don't really realize it is. It's how most people are employed and most people make money, are these massive volume of small businesses that are mostly bankrupt at this point. And yet the big companies are surviving. And that's why we see our stock market indices actually fine, which makes no sense in the face of this massive shrinkage of the economy. In the normal economic models, it would say, well, everything's going to go down, and it's not, because the Amazons are thriving, these large companies are thriving, but the small companies aren't. So what happens next? You've already been given checks by the government, and you're going to want another check, and now all of a sudden you are surviving on handouts from an institution. At least you are, as long as you get your vaccine. And then if you really want to take this down the rabbit hole, it gets very dark. And this is why it's great to have David Icke around, who can really make it feel that it's not much further than you think. And when you start combining it with the tracking and the mobile phone pieces, it really becomes a situation where it's like this Hunger Games society, where we get to a point where you really are forced into doing things you don't want to do for your own economic survival, because you can't go out there and create income the way you used to be able to. I'm going to start a restaurant. I'm going to be a personal trainer. I'm going to be a masseuse. I'm going to be a tutor. All of those things are being shut down now. And yet we see, Jeff Bezos, having record gains. And so it's all suspicious. It's all a bit dark to think about it. And we need to reclaim these businesses back, as soon as possible. I wanted to ask you quickly about the exosomes, because this is something that David Icke mentioned and specifically gave you kind of the credit for it. Maybe you could just define what an exosome is to people. I know you have an entire piece that you've put online that maybe we can actually upload a copy to our channel or give it as a reference here, where you actually go into some of the microscopic evidence. But without going too deep on that, maybe talk about what they are And can some of these kind of false positives be induced by stress and fear and trauma, which is going on in droves right now?
Yeah, absolutely. So, what exosomes are, and they were discovered by scientists about 30 years ago, is that they are small vesicles or little sacs of fluid that bud out of our own cells. So, they're secreted by our own cells, every cell type in our body, and every cell of every mammal at least makes exosomes. And they're made at a baseline rate all the time. So, you're making them right now, as am I. But when you have some kind of illness, and a variety of different illnesses have been shown to cause this, it causes your body to induce exosomes and produce more of them. And the reasons for that are thought to be the main function is that it's thought that they play is in communicating between different cells that are far apart in your body. So it's not the neighbor that they can communicate with other ways, but some remote part of your body. So the structure of exosomes would be that it's very simple. They're very small, the same size as virus particles. There's a range of sizes, but there are for viruses as well. And they have a very simple structure, just a membrane and maybe one or two proteins on the membrane. Usually one of them is a receptor that is like a key mechanism that finds the right lock on the target cell. So it can go into the target cell where it's supposed to communicate. And then inside the vesicle is some kind of genetic material. And it could be a variety of different materials, including various forms of DNA and RNA, just as it has been described in virus particles. So there's another role that has been demonstrated in scientific studies where sometimes these exosomes can actually take up toxic materials like bacterial endotoxins from the environment outside the cells and then prevent the cells from being exposed to those toxic materials. So that may be one role. So the reason why this is so important is one, because the similarities have been recognized by scientists, including virologists, and many times scientists have actually said they're the same thing or they have substantial overlap, including prominent virologists. And then they've also found them to have sometimes a combination of what they call viral RNA or DNA mixed with human RNA or DNA. So remember from what I said earlier that we really don't know the true source of what they call viral genetic material, but nonetheless, whatever it is, they found it in our own body, in these exosomes. So the procedure that's used to isolate and identify a new virus, including the SARS-CoV-2, which is the virus associated with COVID-19, what they do is they take the lung fluid from a sick person, and instead of just trying to purify a virus particle out of that, they mix it with a foreign cell. And most commonly, they use vero cells, which are derived from the kidneys of monkeys. And then they add antibiotics to the cells as well. Now, there are several studies that show that antibiotics is actually one thing that can induce exosomes because it's generally toxic to the cells. So they're basically created a recipe where they're mixing the lung fluid with cells and antibiotics that are going to make exosomes, right? There's no two way about it. They're going to be exosomes from those cells when you mix them with antibiotics. So they then, grow these cells for a few days, up to a week or two, and then they look at it under the microscope and they see little particles and say that that's the virus. But the thing is that there are going to be exosomes in the mixture because you've created the recipe to make exosomes, and they don't account for them at all. So they don't have like a photograph where there's, a red arrow that says points to something they say is a virus, and then a blue arrow that points to something that's an exosome, and they show how they're different from each other. And then they would also then have to purify those from each other to further characterize what's in the virus or the exosome. But they don't mention this at all. So the only conclusion I can come to is that what we're seeing in the pictures must be exosomes because they're going to be there because they basically created the recipe to make exosomes and they don't account for them in any other way. So that has to be what we're looking at.
All right, and so this can also cause these false positive results, and can they also be related to stress?
Well, the test is not testing for a virus, and it's not testing for an exosome. It's testing for a specific genetic sequence, and we don't really know where that genetic sequence comes from, so we don't really know what the test is testing for. But the way that you would design such a test is that you would develop what's called a gold standard. And this is also something that I was taught about in medical school. And they did actually give us an example of this, and it's to diagnose a pulmonary embolism, which is a blood clot in the lungs. And the gold standard test is what's known as an angiogram, where they inject dye into your blood vessels, and then they show under a special type of video x ray uh, that the dye stops because something's blocking it. And that's the blood clot. Now, and they compared that with another test called a VQ scan, or a ventilation perfusion scan. And they compare this new test, the scan, to the gold standard. And that's how they determine, is it accurate? Does it capture every case? Does it give you false positives? What's the error rate? Now, for COVID 19, they've never demonstrated that they have purified and isolated a specific viral particle. But that would be a gold standard. So if, let's say, they took 100 patients, and from 100 patients, they isolated this viral particle that they could easily identify as to what it was. And then they compared that result to the results of a PCR test or an antibody test or any other test they wanted to develop. They would then be able to see how accurate it was and calculate an error rate. But this has never been done because there's no gold standard test. They're trying to say that this genetic test is the gold standard, but there's no way it could be because we don't really know the source of what it's testing. There was one study that tried to estimate the accuracy of the test, and it did this by using some mathematical analysis, like statistical analysis, not a computer model. And then it also followed people longitudinally. So they would have a test result, they'd be asymptomatic, and then you wait a couple of weeks and say, do they get sick or not? And they estimated the false positive rate of the test to be 80%. So, in other words, 4 out of 5 people that have a positive test don't have any illness. So very, very inaccurate testing. We don't know what it measures. It has no known error rate. So basically, essentially, it's just worthless. But the exosomes is what they're showing under the microscope and saying is a virus, and that's really where the exosome becomes most relevant. Now, whenever we're sick from virtually any type of illness, and even from psychological shock, so if we suddenly lose a loved one to a traffic accident or something like that, we would actually make more exosomes due to the response that we have, the psychological response. And they've been shown to occur with uh, toxins like heavy metals or pesticides or antibiotics. They're also shown to be induced with ionizing radiation, like X-rays or gamma rays, with infections, with asthma. So pretty much almost any illness will cause us to make more exosomes, and they're a response to the underlying disease state, and most likely function to help us recover from that. You could think about them as sort of uh, a collaborator or a partner with our immune system in that respect.
I must say it's really interesting talking to you right now because, I'm flashing back to our conversation with David Icke 3 weeks ago, and a lot of people accuse him of not having evidence and having theories. And here I am talking to a guy who, spent time at MIT the same year as I did, who's done the research, who is now putting together an extremely credible argument talking about something that he cited. So I don't know, for me, this is like a strange virtual reality for me where I get to see you on the back end. And I think it's an important thing to have you here talking about this. Let me ask you and finish off with a practical question, but probably the most important question I could ask you from this entire conversation. And that is this. If someone's watching us right now, they are probably open-minded to the fact that what they're being told is not true. They are probably open-minded to the fact that something's not right here, that some of these distancing measures, that the halt in our economy, that the actual possibility that COVID-19 might not create a disease is possible. And that's why they're watching us. And yet, doctor, they're surrounded by family members and friends and colleagues that cannot even begin to entertain that idea, that are terrified to leave their homes. I know people that haven't left their home in 55 days. I know these people. And they're fairly credible, intelligent people. How can they begin to have this conversation with these people to get to where they can start to open their mind? Because I know there's a lot of ways they can't begin that because they'll get them to shut out. What's your advice to how to start this dialogue with other people?
Well, I want to say that I can really relate to the people out there in this situation because I'm in the same situation. The people in my life, including family members and neighbors and colleagues, they don't agree with my opinion at all, and they don't even want to talk to me about it at all. So I think one thing is it's very important to respect other people's authority to make their own decisions and look at their own information, and that it's important to have compassion for those people, because I think what is really going on is that ever since we grow up as children, we're sort of indoctrinated to certain things, and one of those things is that we respect authority and that we rely on designated experts to give us information. And I think it's really detrimental to our development because, in a way, it infantilizes us that we don't believe that we have the ability to make our own decisions about things, that we have to look up to some authority figure, just as children look to their parents. And when you're a child, it's important because the child doesn't know, and they may not have the capacity to know until they reach a certain developmental stage. But as adults, I think it's really critical that we think for ourselves and that we investigate things, that we don't just sit idly and listen to everything that's told to us. If you look back in history, you'll see over and over again that governments not only lied to and misled their citizens, but actually have exterminated them in large scales. Look into something called democide. We all know about what happened in the Russian Revolution in Nazi Germany, in Cambodia, in Turkey, in China, right? I mean, there's just countless examples, and I know I'm leaving out several where the government just out and out exterminated its own people. So don't think that that can't happen again. I'm not saying that that's what's going on exactly right now, but I'm just showing that, you don't have to, or it's unwise to just blindly trust what the government authority says because they have such a track record of not being honest. So I believe personally that some people, as a result of this kind of indoctrination, are really just not open to hearing another perspective. And I think this is really magnified by the intensity of the fear response. So the people who are so afraid of getting sick and dying that they won't even come out of their homes, they're only really able to consider information that is directly relevant to their survival, and they're not going to be able to step out of that and look at the big picture and notice that there's inconsistencies, many obvious inconsistencies in what we're being told that they could investigate. So, I'm not really targeting those people because they're just closed off to thinking about this. Instead, I am trying to, give them my compassion, and I really feel for them because they are going to be the ones to just blindly do whatever they're told, and they're going to suffer the consequences of that without even realizing it. But the people that I'm really trying to convey this information to are people that already notice that there's something not right, something smells fishy, and many people have contacted me, with this notion, and they're like, what do I do? What do I look at? And it's a very frantic place to be in because you've never really considered this perspective before, that maybe the authority is not your friend, and so it's very new and scary. And so I think it's really important to avoid any pitfalls. Like, a lot of us might be tempted to, veg out in front of the TV, load up on, nostalgic and convenience and junk food, or even, start drinking to forget about, maybe to treat our fear or to forget about what's going on. And those things are not gonna help you deal with this situation. I'm not saying you should run yourself ragged. It's really important to rest and take care of yourself, but you want to be in a position to be able to think clearly. And so, what I would say to those people is, first and foremost, turn off the television. Stop watching, CNN and Fox and NBC and MSNBC and all of those outlets, because they're just giving you the same story over and over again. Instead, consider looking to the real journalism that's out there now, which is, people like this platform, and people like James Corbett, who are doing really thorough, thoughtful analysis and well referenced analysis, and they're reporting on what's really going on. Or do your own research. Look at the source materials like I have. Now, I know it could be really intimidating to look at a scientific paper, but I don't believe that anyone is incapable of doing it with the right preparation. So, just because I'm a doctor and you're not doesn't mean you can't make head or tails of what's in a paper, because you can still see contradictions even if you don't understand all the details. And that should be enough to question things. But certainly you can just look at how many people died on a CDC website or another official website and say, geez, how many people died last year? Wow, look at that. The numbers are almost the same. So what does that mean? Not more people are dying now, so why are we stuck in our house? And that kind of thinking is going to lead you to understand the truth, and then you can make informed decisions about how you want to deal with it and how you want to interact with your family and teach them about what's going on and what to do. And I want to say that also it's really, really important that you take care of yourself. And I don't think you need to worry about boosting up your immune system or anything like that, because there's no disease to defend yourself from. But if you're healthy overall, your immune system is also going to be healthy as well. And so, what I recommend to be healthy would be some simple things: eat clean food, not processed food, eat whole foods in there, that look like they do in nature, drink clean water, drink a lot of water. Make sure that you're going to the bathroom so your body can eliminate toxins. Get out in the sunlight. You need to make some vitamin D. We need to be outside. It's our natural state. We need to get a little bit of exercise. So go take a walk around your neighborhood, go to the parks, go hiking. Don't worry about the restrictions. Even in New York, the governor was shown on record saying that they really can't enforce any of these matters. They're really voluntary, even though they intimidate us into it. And so you can be rest assured that, most likely there are going to be no serious consequences for doing these things. And you have a God-given right to go out there and enjoy nature and be free in the world. And so if you do all these things, look at some new information, be a little bit skeptical, question things, turn off the TV, avoid the junk food and the alcohol, eat the clean food, be close with your family, hold hands, give hugs. We need that physical affection as well as closeness to people. I think you're going to come out in a really good position. You're going to feel good about yourself. You're going to have hope for the future. You're going to be able to make decisions of how you're going to do your little part to bring about a better future for you, your family, and for the rest of humanity. And that's exactly what I'm trying to do.
Well, that is extremely sound advice. And I really appreciate you for the work you've done, for really, putting your head above the parapet, and really being able to take some shots, and also combining your research with your perspective. I had really just seen you talk scientifically, and so it's great to see you put it into this entire kind of global perspective, and give people these messages. And I agree with you. This is the time to stay strong. This is the time to stay aware. This is the time to have conversations with other people, because like you said, and this is one of the most powerful things you said, We are so much bigger than the people that are enforcing these constraints on us by orders of magnitude. And if you haven't gone to MIT, that means tens and hundreds and thousands of times we are bigger. And so we have this power. It's all about information. This could be over in days if enough people got the information and made their own decision. That's actually true. And so we can be as quickly out of this as we got into this if people can think freely and we can make some intelligent decisions. So thank you. I really appreciate you. I appreciate the time. We're going to have links below back to your websites and to some of those videos that I mentioned. And it's been great having a conversation where I'm not worried about who's going to watch or if it's going to be allowed. So thanks for your time. Next time, let's do this where we can shake hands and be in the same room.
I would love that. I really would. And thank you so much for the opportunity. It really means a lot to me that you would consider having someone like me on the show. And I think you're really doing a great service for the public out there.
All right. Well, thank you so much. All right. Appreciate your time. And for everyone else that's still here, thank you for watching this. This has been our digital freedom platform. It's a brand new way of us fighting back against the forces of censorship, and it's working. And we're so proud of it. If you've enjoyed this video, please share it on the sidebar, get the word out, and let people know what we're doing here. And again, as I said in the beginning, I pledge that this will not be edited, this will not be censored, this will not be banned, and that we're putting these pieces on this platform and using our own technology to stream them and keep them archived so you can constantly have access to this information. It's super important. And again, if you want to be one of the founding members of the Digital Freedom Platform, go to londonreal.tv/freedom, and you can be one of the founding members and be a part of this infrastructure. We're super proud. You know, we started off by funding the streaming of this upcoming episode on Sunday, which we're calling Rose Ike 3, which is going to be the biggest live stream of a conversation in human history. It's going to be massive, and we want as many people to watch it, download it, remember it, and save it somewhere. And that's what this platform is all about. And it's about other guests such as yourself. I'm very excited to have you here. And also, we want to take it to the next level. We want to use a blockchain technology to distribute this network. We also want to build an app accessible on all devices